Hello, welcome back to the channel. Today I got a little reaction video for all of you to see what the reactionist is posting about. It is a video about the Holy Grail, so let's lock in and check it out.
A cup, the sacred vessel said to have held the blood of Christ. It appears in paintings, in films, in the stories we were told as children. A relic so powerful that entire kingdoms were built around finding it. And yet, when we return to the earliest accounts of the Holy Grail, that image begins to slip. Because in one of the very first Grail stories, it is not described as a cup at all.
I heard that before as well. I heard that it stands for many other things than a cup, and in the first stories it wasn't a cup at all, but let's keep watching.
That detail, changing. Welcome back, Darklings. The Holy Grail, we're told, is the cup Jesus used at the Last Supper. It is said to be the vessel he lifted from the table, filled with wine, blessed, and passed among his disciples.
Who remembers that scene from that famous movie with Nichols Cage, that Illuminati movie where the the space between Jesus and Mary is the Holy Grail. So it represents basically knowledge or gnosis and the coming together of the divine masculine and feminine and a lot of esoteric stuff. Like, I love it.
Among his disciples. Later legend claimed that this same vessel was used again by Joseph of Arimathea to collect Christ's blood at the crucifixion. And in those later traditions, it was not just a relic, but something believed to hold miraculous power. A vessel said to heal, to sustain, even to grant life. But it is important to separate the legend from the Bible itself. The New Testament does mention a cup at the Last Supper, but the Bible does not call that cup the Holy Grail, nor does it say that Joseph of Arimathea used it to catch Christ's blood at the cross. And it makes no mention of the cup having any special or supernatural power. So where did those ideas come from? To answer that, we need to go back to the earliest Grail story.
I know we can't get into that today, but what I found always so suspiciously prevalent in Christianity is that obsession with blood, no? Like drinking the blood of Christ and like being washed in the blood and like consuming and then like here on the Grail, I'm like, is that a death cult? Is it a blood cult? And why is Jesus like always portrayed in his worst hour? I know that they try to apologize for it by saying it's a reminder of his sacrifice, but if I would make a new world religion where I want to empower the people and I want to, would I depict my Messiah in his worst hour when he was dying? Like, what other religion does that? I can't remember, but like this obsession with death is very prevalent.
And what we find there is far stranger than most people realize. To find the Grail, we have to go back to medieval France, to a poet named Chrétien de Troyes. Writing in the late 12th century, he gives us one of the earliest surviving accounts of the Grail, in a story known as Percival. In it, a young knight arrives at the castle of a mysterious wounded king, and during a meal, he witnesses something strange. A procession. A young man passes through the hall carrying a bleeding lance. 2 boys follow with tall candlesticks, and then a maiden, carrying what the text calls a grail. Now this is important, because in Chrétien's time, the word grail did not automatically mean a chalice. It likely referred to a wide, shallow vessel, something closer to a serving dish than the golden cup most people imagine. And stranger still, this object is not introduced as the cup of Christ. It is not linked to the Last Supper. There is no mention of Joseph of Arimathea or the crucifixion.
It's way older. It was in British and Albania. What was it called? It was called Albany, I think. Folklore already in Scottish. So yeah, it predates the Bible, I would say.
Instead, This Grail simply appears, mysterious, revered, clearly important, but unexplained, and yet everything in the scene seems to revolve around it. The atmosphere shifts as it enters, the procession slows, the moment deepens. Everyone present seems to understand something that Percival does not, and he never questions it. He watches, and then he says nothing. And that silence matters, because this moment becomes the turning point of the story. Percival has been taught not to ask too many questions, and that restraint costs him. The story centres around this moral lesson. This all unfolds in the world of King Arthur. The Arthurian legends already existed, and were widely known, drawing on earlier Welsh and Brittonic traditions. But as far as our surviving texts show, the Grail is nowhere in those stories, or anywhere else in literature, until this moment. Later, we are told that the Grail carries a single...
Still. Not surviving. We don't have any surviving texts. Who knows? And I think, a chalice or like a basin with holy liquid, that is not unique.
Communion wafer, enough to sustain the wounded king's father. So even here, the object has power. It nourishes, sustains, perhaps even heals, but it is not yet the Grail we recognise. It is something less defined and far more strange. And then another writer comes along and changes everything. Not long after Chrétien, another writer takes up the story, a German poet called Wolfram von Eschenbach. His version is called Parzival, and at first...
Eschenbach, just by the way, is a very important person. You need to Google him if you're into all of this kind of like folklore and mythology. Eschenbach is a super good source for like an entry into like Germanic folklore and therefore also Arthurian legends.
Glance, it feels very familiar. A wounded king, a mysterious castle, a sacred object at the centre of it all. But when he describes the Grail, something changes, quietly but completely. Because in this version, the Holy Grail is not a cup, it is a stone, not a chalice, not a vessel, not something raised at a table or passed between hands, a stone. And not only that, it has a strange name, the lapsit exilis, a phrase that has puzzled scholars ever since. No one agrees exactly what it means. Some translate it as a heavenly stone, or a stone from heaven. Others interpret it differently, as a fallen stone, or a stone of exile, something cast down, or separated.
It's probably from lapis lazuli, no? I'll write it down. Lapis lazuli.
From its source. Which is interesting, because in Wolfram's story, the Grail is not just a mysterious object, it has a backstory. Wolfram describes the Grail as connected to angels, but not in the way you might expect. He writes of a group of angels who, during Lucifer's rebellion, did not side with Lucifer, but also did not fight for God. A third group, neither rebellious nor fully aligned with the Almighty, and according to his story, the Grail is entrusted to them, but it does not remain with them. Because later, in Wolfram's account, it comes under the protection of a mysterious human brotherhood, a group Wolfram calls the Templisen. The name is striking, because it closely resembles the Knights Templar, a real medieval order founded in the early 12th century. Many scholars see this as Wolfram weaving a Templar-like brotherhood into his story, guardians of a sacred object set apart from the ordinary world. That connection would echo through Grail legend for centuries. But if that isn't strange enough, there is another comparison that some readers have noticed. The name lapsit exilis has sometimes been compared to lapis elixir, the philosopher's stone of alchemy. That idea isn't universally accepted, but the similarities are difficult to ignore.
But, I love etymology.
Both objects
anyway,
are said to sustain life, heal,
and
and
you need to do
extend
some
vitality.
research into this afterwards, of course. But and this design right here is very Phoenician, no? This is like a very Phoenician looking design. Paradigma operis philosophiae. This paradigma functioning, or this of the functioning philosopher. Yeah, very interesting, but I see the connections. I don't believe all these experts when they say, oh, these are all isolated incidences and they have no connection. I mean, if it's in the word, if they sound alike. And lapis lazuli, look into it, in alchemy is a very special stone. Like even in Kemet or Old Egypt, and in Mithrandirism, the Roman and Greek secret religions, it's very prevalent. So yeah, even in Gnosticism they loved lapis lazuli, so I have one too, so get yourself one.
Not a container for something sacred, but the source of it. Not something you drink from, but something that gives and sustains life, something that feels less like a relic and more like a force. So how did we get from a mysterious platter in a medieval procession, or a life-giving stone with an uncertain name, to the image of a cup we all recognise? To answer that, we need to look at what happens next. Because after Chrétien, and after Wolfram, another writer enters the story. Writing around the end of the 12th century, Robert de Boron does something crucial. He gives the Grail a history. For the first time, he explicitly connects it to Christ. In his version, the Grail is no longer a mysterious object in a castle. It is the vessel used at the Last Supper, the cup Jesus raised before his disciples. And more than that, it becomes the vessel used to collect his blood at the crucifixion, carried by Joseph of Arimathea, and with that, everything changes.
And that's how it happens usually, you know, that's how it happens. Already established folklore and traditions get retold in a new story, and the people of the time probably had, of course, 3-4 stories containing with each other, contending with each other, and they accepted all of them because they knew the original, or what they seemed as the original. But then over time, the powers that be can just change history by deciding which story is now canon, and therefore all the generations afterwards only hear that new story and get told that it is the only and true story, and therefore it is then new tradition, even though it is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, you know. So very interesting. But right in that instance, you see how history gets made by these people.
Because now the Grail is no longer undefined. It is given a place within Christian history as a sacred relic, and once that connection is made, it spreads. Through later stories, through retellings, through the influence of the Church itself. The Grail becomes the holy chalice, the cup of Christ, the object people begin to search for, not as a mystery, but as something that physically existed, something that could be found. And this is the moment the image hardens, the moment the Grail becomes the image we all hold in our minds. What began as something mysterious, something undefined, was reshaped, reinterpreted, and given new meaning. And much later, the Grail would change again. In some modern interpretations, the Grail is no longer an object at all, but a bloodline. The idea comes from a later reading of San Grail, the Holy Grail, as Sang Riel, or royal blood. Popularised by books like the Da Vinci Code, it suggests the Grail was not a cup, but the lineage of Jesus Christ. Most historians reject this as a modern reinterpretation, not part of the earliest Grail tradition, but it shows us that the Grail has never stayed the same. The Grail did not begin as the cup, it became the cup. But that leaves us with a puzzle. What were those earliest Grail stories describing, if not the cup of Christ? To answer that, we have to step outside the medieval romances and look further back. Much further. Because some scholars have suggested that the Grail may not have begun as a Christian relic at all, but as part of something ancient. A pattern of sacred objects and symbols existed long before medieval writers tied the Grail to the Last Supper. And this is where the trail becomes interesting. The earliest Grail romances appear in a literary world already steeped in older Celtic material. The stories of King Arthur are not purely medieval inventions. They draw heavily on early...
Just one moment. I love those old castles, and imagine this estate in its heyday. Like, and how magical just the world feels if you come home and you see this castle, or if you live around it or inside of it, and like, I don't know, and all of these stone towers in the cities and these huge cathedrals.
Welsh and Brittonic traditions, stories passed down via word of mouth long before they were written down. And within them, we find echoes of much older myth. French writers like Chrétien were drawing on Arthurian traditions that had travelled through Breton and Anglo-Norman channels. That's not to say the Grail is simply a Celtic object, but it does help explain why, when the Grail first appears in literature, it already feels less like the ordinary cup in the New Testament and more like something out of myth. Take the Welsh tale Peredur son of Evrawg, preserved in the tradition later known as the Mabinogion. It contains a strikingly similar procession scene. A bleeding spear is carried into a hall. 2 maidens carry a platter before the hero. But in this version, the Grail is not the object of importance. Instead, upon the platter is a severed head. The scene is ritualistic, shocking, full of blood and meaning, but not Christian. And yet, the structure is almost identical to Chrétien's story. It is worth noting that this Welsh tale was recorded later than Chrétien's version, and its exact relationship to it is still debated. But the Mabinogion preserves older Welsh material drawn from oral tradition. And when we look to Irish tradition, we find something similar again. The Lia Fall, the Stone of Destiny, is said to cry out beneath the rightful king. It is also associated in later tradition with renewing the king's strength and granting him a long and prosperous reign. According to these stories, it was brought to Ireland by a semi-divine people, the Tuatha Dé Danann, figures
People of the goddess Danann. And these are like basically from Avalon or from like this mythical island. These people who came to Ireland or Britain and teach the ancestors their ways. So these are Tuatha Dé Danann, a very beautiful picture. And we don't know where the Tuatha Dé Danann, where that came from either. It's a very interesting read up on.
So is it possible that these older Celtic stories of magical objects were later reshaped, absorbed into a Christian framework, and became what we now call the Holy Grail? It's not proof, but a pattern many believe is too old and too specific to ignore. But if you think that was strange...
Amazing. And that's also the problem, like with all of these mythologies, a lot of the older traditions only had word of mouth, or their books and records got destroyed. So the church can claim ultimate authority or Christian supremacy over these stories because they made sure to wipe out all of the contestants, you know? And like, even in Greece, one of the first like Bronze Age civilizations, the Minoans in Crete, we don't know their language until now. We can't, because it's an isolated. We don't know what language that they spoke, and they predated all of the Greek ancestors, and a lot of the Greek ancestors stole from the Minoan culture and traditions, and they were a super peaceful race. They didn't even have defensive walls on their island between their temples and castles, implicating that they didn't fight that many wars. Otherwise you would immediately build a wall after a sanctuary or temples were done. So yeah, very interesting, but also to really think about it. It's not that Christian stories or the Christian worldview is the best one. It's the only one that we have surviving, you know, because they burned and killed a lot of them. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you could like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated. And if you don't want to miss a future upload of mine and see it as soon as it hits town, click on the bell. Love you guys and have a great week. Bye.